Since it was first publicly recognized in 1981, acquired immune deficiency syndrome has led to the deaths of more than 35 million people, according to the United Nations AIDS Agency, making it one of the most destructive epidemics in recorded history. 2 million people are infected every year, and more than 1 million people died of it last year. Despite recent improved access to antiretroviral treatment and care in many regions of the world, the AIDS epidemic claimed approximately 3.1 million lives in 2005, of which 570,000 were children. UNAIDS and the World Health Organization estimate that the total number of people living with the human immunodeficiency virus has reached its highest level. There are an estimated 40.3 million people now living with HIV. The number of people living with HIV continues to rise in most parts of the world, despite strenuous prevention strategies. Sub-Saharan Africa remains by far the worst affected region, with 24.7 million people living with HIV and 1.5 million new HIV infections every year. 64% of all people living with HIV are in Sub-Saharan Africa, as are more than 77% of all women living with HIV. South and Southeast Asia are second most affected with 15%. A quick Wikipedia search will show that Robert Charles Gallo is an American biomedical researcher and is best known for his role in the discovery of the human immunodeficiency virus and in the development of the HIV blood test, and he has been a major contributor to subsequent HIV research. However, once secreted government documents revealed by Dr. Leonard Horowitz in his book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional, show that Dr. Gallo has a direct communication to the creation of what we call the HIV virus. Now remember these names, people. Roy Ashe, Henry Kissinger, and Vice President Nelson Rockefeller were all financial investors in a company called Lytton Bionetics, under the new National Cancer Institute Bionetics Administration at the Army's Fort Detrick facility. This is where AIDS was created. These people started a program called the Special Virus Cancer Program that began in 1962, which engaged in cancer virus studies using Lytton Bionetics supplied monkeys and chimpanzees. By 1966, Lytton Bionetics researchers advanced recombinant retroviruses, causing the never-before-seen leukemia, lymphoma, sarcoma, immune-suppressive cancers, and by 1968, studies describing these developments were published. In 1968, Dr. Gallo was the National Cancer Institute's project officer at Lytton Bionetics, where new cancer viruses that were descriptively and functionally identical to HIV/AIDS were being created and tested. A year later, in 1969, Henry Kissinger, while serving as the White House National Security Advisor, selected the option for the use of these bioweapons for the military, and by 1970, the United States Defense Department ordered these viruses for use. Now we come to the German Merck family, which began selling drugs in 1668. Lytton Bionetics supplied the Merck pharmaceutical company with the bioweapon that we now call HIV and AIDS to the world, and this was even admitted by the company's then vaccine chief, Maurice Hilleman. And one of the first places they experimented these bioweapons on was mentally handicapped children at Willowbrook State School through a contaminated hepatitis B vaccination trial between 1970 and 1974. By 1976, after incubating the new Bionetics-engineered and Merck-supplied viruses for 2 to 5 years, the children at Willowbrook were rumored to be ill with a strange new disease. This was just the beginning of what we now call HIV and AIDS. This is the true story as to how HIV/AIDS was created. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, originally stemming from Lytton Bionetics and distributed by Merck through contaminated vaccination trials. Now, this is how AIDS was distributed into the American populace. This new bioweapon was then introduced to the American public through a hepatitis B vaccination trial conducted at the New York Blood Bank in 1978. The experiment at the New York Blood Bank was run by a man named Wolf Zimmunes, who joined the New York Blood Center in 1969 and headed its laboratory of epidemiology since 1973. This hepatitis B vaccination trial was specifically for gay men who were injected with the vaccine at the New York Blood Center in Manhattan during the period of November 1978 to October 1979. As quoted in the New York Times, Zimmunes was in charge of the hepatitis B vaccine field trials that began in 1978 and that were conducted among 1,083 male homosexuals. Researchers in these labs, led by Wolf Zimmunes, used the contaminated hepatitis B vaccines delivered from Merck, which infected these gay men in New York. Similar hepatitis B vaccine experiments were conducted in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, St. Louis, and Chicago beginning in 1980. Months after the experiment began, the first cases of AIDS reported to the CDC appeared in young gay men in Manhattan in 1979. The first San Francisco AIDS case appeared in the city in September 1980, 6 months after the hepatitis B experiment started there. In June 1981, the AIDS epidemic became official.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer. Robert Bazell now in Atlanta.
Bobby Campbell of San Francisco and Billy Walker of New York both suffer from a mysterious newly discovered disease which affects mostly homosexual men, but has also been found in heterosexual men and women. The condition severely weakens the body's ability to fight disease. Many victims get a rare form of cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. Others get an infection known as pneumocystis pneumonia. Researchers know of 413 people who have contracted the condition in the past year. 1/3 have died and none have been cured.
Death didn't scare me. It was living with this for a long time. That's more frightening than death.
Investigators have examined the habits of homosexuals for clues.
I was in the fast lane at one time in terms of the way that I lived my life, and now I'm not.
The best guess is that some infectious agent is causing it. Today, researchers here at the National Centers for Disease Control said they had found several cases where people who had been sex partners both had the condition. The scientists say this probably means they are dealing with some new, deadly, sexually transmitted disease. The investigators see this as a serious public health problem.
From an epidemic point of view, there have been more deaths from Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia than have occurred with all the cases of toxic shock syndrome and the Philadelphia outbreak of Legionnaire's disease combined.
Researchers are now studying blood and other samples from the victims, trying to learn what is causing the disease. So far, they have had no luck. Robert Bazell, NBC News, Atlanta.
After the hepatitis B experiment ended, Wolf Zimmunes insisted that all 13,000 blood specimens donated by gay men be retained at the blood center for future use. Several years later, when this blood was retested for the presence of HIV antibodies, government epidemiologists were able to detect the introduction and the spread of HIV into the gay community. Zimmunes himself said that one day another disease may erupt and will need this material. The retesting of gay blood at the blood center proved that HIV was first introduced into the gay population of New York City sometime around 1978 to 1979, the same year the hepatitis B vaccine trials under Zimmunes' leadership began. The Puerto Rican cancer experiment, launched in 1931 by the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Investigations in San Juan, was led by Dr. Cornelius Rhodes. Now, this is an example of how the Rockefellers have always supported eugenics and their true nature. Now, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes carried out this experiment in which 13 Puerto Ricans died after being purposefully infected with cancer. In a letter to a colleague obtained by the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, Rhodes wrote, "The Puerto Ricans are beyond a doubt the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate, and thievish race of men ever inhabiting this sphere. It makes you sick to inhabit the same island with them. What the island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave or something to totally exterminate the population. It might then be livable. I have done my best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more. The latter has not resulted in any fatalities so far. The matter of consideration for the patient's welfare plays no role here. In fact, all physicians take delight in the abuse and torture of the unfortunate subjects." Dr. Rhodes was never held accountable for his crimes. He was in fact awarded the Legion of Merit and then appointed to the staff of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. This was during the 1950s when the commission was carrying out radiation experiments on unwitting hospital patients, mentally retarded children, prisoners, and soldiers. In fact, the Atomic Energy Commission was intimately involved in the National Cancer Institute's Cancer Virus Research Program during the 1960s and early 1970s. Their joint AEC-NCI Molecular Anatomy Cancer Program, directed by Dr. Norman Anderson, extensively studied human embryo tissues during early and mid-gestation. Anderson and a host of AEC and NCI researchers, including Robert Gallo's superior, Robert Maneker, injected human fetal specimens with various viral mutants in an effort to develop cancers and vaccines. Among their major findings announced in a 1971 DHEW publication was that by bombarding fetuses with ionizing radiation, the researchers were able to cause tumor-like reactions in adults. More importantly, in the spring of 1944, Merck and Company received a large cash infusion from Martin Bormann, Hitler's top minister overseeing rocket production by the Nazis and chief financial officer for the Third Reich. This as the time Merck's president, George W. Merck, was advising President Roosevelt and initiating strategies as America's biological weapons industry director. According to CBS News correspondent Paul Manning, the lion's share of the Nazi gold went to 750 corporations, largely including Merck, to secure a virtual monopoly over the world's chemical and pharmaceutical industries. This was done not only for Germany's economic recovery, but to assure the rise of the Fourth Reich. Merck, then along with Rockefeller, partner I.G. Farben, received huge sums of money from the Nazi war chest to actualize Hitler's proclaimed vision of a 1,000-year Third Reich and world empire. This was outlined with clarity in a document called Neuordnung, or New Order, that was accompanied by a letter of transmittal to the Bormann-led Ministry of Economics. "Bury your treasure," Hitler advised Bormann, "for you will need it to begin a Fourth Reich." The Rockefeller Foundation became the prime promoter of depopulation activities by the United Nations. Evidence showed the foundation and its corporate medical and political associates organized the racial mass murder program of Nazi Germany. Oil monopolist John D. Rockefeller created the Rockefeller Foundation in 1909, and by 1929 had invested $300 million worth of the family's controlling interest in the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, now called Exxon, into the foundation's account. This money created the field of psychiatric genetics and funded the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Eugenics, and Human Heredity. The Rockefellers' chief executive in charge of these institutions was the fascist Swiss psychiatrist Ernst Rudin, assisted by his protégés Ottmar Verschuer and Franz J. Kalman. In 1932, the British-led eugenics movement designated the Rockefellers' Dr. Rubin as the president of the Worldwide Eugenics Federation. Only a few months later, Hitler rose to power and the Rockefeller-Rudin apparatus became a section of the Nazi state. Rudin then headed the Racial Hygiene Society. Rudin and his staff, as part of the task force of hereditary experts chaired by SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, drew up the sterilization law. In the United States, this law was described as a model law and was adopted in July 1933, as published in the September 1933 Eugenical News with Hitler's signature attached. Rudin's protege, Verschuer, and his assistant, Auschwitz medical chief Joseph Mengele, jointly authored reports for special courts to reinforce Rudin's racial purity law against cohabitation of Aryans and non-Aryans. They also produced films to sell their racial cleansing ideas. Under the Nazis, the German chemical company IG Farben and Rockefeller Standard Oil of New Jersey were effectively a single firm, merged in hundreds of cartel arrangements. IG Farben was led, up until 1937, by the Warburg family, Rockefeller's partner in banking and in the design of Nazi German eugenics. During the war, IG Farben built a huge factory at Auschwitz to capitalize on Standard Oil IG Farben patents to make gasoline from coal with the help of concentration camp slave labor. The SS was then assigned to select and guard the inmates deemed fit for IG Farben's workforce. Those judged unfit were killed. Additional Rockefeller-linked Nazi atrocities include, in 1936, Rockefeller's Dr. Franz Kallmann interrupted his study of hereditary degeneracy and emigrated to America because he was half Jewish. Kallmann went to New York and established the Medical Genetic Department of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. The Scottish Rite of Freemasonry published Kallmann's study of over 1,000 cases of schizophrenia, which tried to prove its hereditary basis. In the book, Kallmann thanked his longtime boss and mentor Rudin. Kallmann's book, published in 1938 in the USA and Nazi Germany, was used by the T4 unit as a rationalization to begin in 1939 the murder of mental patients and various defective people, perhaps most of them children. Gas and lethal injections were used to kill 250,000 under this program, in which the staffs for a broader murder program were desensitized and trained. Chatkin detailed additional links between Rockefeller interests and the horrific medical experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. In 1943, Joseph Mengele's superior, the director of Rockefeller's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Eugenics, and Human Heredity in Berlin, Ottmar Verschuer, secured funds for genetic experiments from the German Research Council. In a progress report Verschuer wrote for the council, he stated, "My co-researcher in this research is my assistant, the anthropologist and physician Mengele, with the permission of the Reichsführer S. Himmler. Anthropological research is being undertaken on the various racial groups, and the concentration camps and blood samples will be sent to my laboratory for investigation." Mengele and Verschuer were especially interested in studying twins during their special protein investigations that required daily blood drawings. Needles were stabbed into people's eyes for eye color experiments. Others were injected with foreign blood and infectious agents. Limbs and organs were commonly removed, occasionally without anesthetics. Women were sterilized, men were castrated, and sexes were surgically altered. Thousands were butchered, and their heads, eyeballs, limbs, and organs were delivered to Mengele, Verschuer, and the Rockefeller contingent at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Later, in 1946, Verschuer, according to Chatkin, requested assistance from the Bureau of Human Heredity in London to keep his scientific research going. A year later, the Bureau moved to Copenhagen, and its new Danish facility was built with Rockefeller money. It was here that the first International Congress in Human Genetics convened. A decade later, Verschuer became a member of the American Eugenics Society, an organizational clone of Rockefeller's Population Council. According to Chatkin, Dr. Kallmann directed the American Eugenics Society from 1954 to 1965. He helped rescue Verschuer by testifying at his denazification hearings. And it was Kallmann who created the American Society of Human Genetics, organizers of the Human Genome Project, currently a $3 billion effort to map the genetics of humanity along with each race's special disease susceptibilities. During the 1950s, the Rockefellers reorganized the U.S. eugenics movement in their own family office, with spin-off population control and abortion groups, and the Eugenics Society address changed to the Society for the Study of Social Biology, its current name. Moreover, with support from the Rockefellers, the Eugenics Society set up a subcommittee called the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which for 12 years had no other address than the Eugenics Society. In conclusion, the Rockefeller Foundation has long financed the eugenics movement in England and is the private international apparatus which has set up the world for a global holocaust under the UN flag through contaminated vaccinations, including HIV/AIDS and now Ebola. In 1968, as the World Health Organization and National Cancer Institute viral research quietly expanded, a growing wave of world opposition to biological weapons came crashing down on Fort Detrick's Gate. The scene was set in 1968 as these Army biowarfare labs were operating at full tilt on numerous assignments, including the testing of synthetic viruses designed to attack the very nature of human immunity. At the same time, medical experts and political leaders from around the world shamed America for its continued biological weapons program and its use of chemical weapons in Vietnam. As a calculated public relations ploy designed to bolster sagging public opinion and counter threatened congressional funding, Detrick's Public Relations Department announced the fort's plan to celebrate its silver anniversary. In response, protests erupted on Detrick's perimeter. Fort Detrick was the nation's largest and most sophisticated biological weapons testing center. The facility employed some 300 scientists, including 140 microbiologists, 40 of whom had PhDs, 150 specialists in other disciplines ranging from plant pathology to mathematical statistics, and between 700 and 1,000 supporting staff. The operation occupied some 1,230 acres of federally owned land, upon which 450 structures were maintained. It produced annually some 900,000 mice, 50,000 guinea pigs, 2,500 rabbits, and 4,000 monkeys. There was also a large corral area for holding larger animals such as horses, cattle, and sheep. The cost of running Detrick's biological weapons research alone was reported at $21.9 million in 1969. Among the academic festivals planned for Detrick's 25th anniversary was an international symposium dealing with the entry and control of foreign nucleic acid into cells during the process of human and animal immunosuppression. The frank threat of manipulating nature's own genetic blueprint for life and celebrating its possibilities brought sharp protests from leading scientists. Despite their harshest warnings on April 4th and 5th, 1969, Detrick played host to the American Institute of Biological Sciences sponsored event. The AIBS involvement additionally outraged conscientious objectors. A boycott ensued that was believed to be unparalleled in the stormy history of relationships between the military and the scientific community. As Science News reported, at least 16 scientists refused to give papers at a Detrick-sponsored symposium on nucleic acids as part of a half-spontaneous, half-organized protest against the use of science for destructive military purposes. Some scientists rejected Detrick's invitation shortly after it was received. Others accepted the invitation, but then, after receiving letters and calls from their colleagues, decided to withdraw. 4 scientists even withdrew after the final program had been printed, thus forcing Detrick to arrange the program at the last minute. Pickets marched outside Detrick's main gate carrying signs that proclaimed Fort Detrick is not a respectable scientific institution, and Fort Detrick scientists are prostitutes. One sign asks, "Want to get sick? Consult your local physician at Fort Detrick," and several signs were decorated with drawings of skulls. Mark Patashny, A Harvard graduate researcher declined on the grounds that he found Dietrich's work highly repellent and did not want my name associated with Fort Detrick. Dean Fraser, a professor of microbiology at Indiana University, balked at celebrating research conducted in an effort to develop biological weapons. He wrote declining the invitation that seems at best a little like commemorating the creation of the electric chair, and at worst like celebrating the establishment of the Chow. Even some AIBS officials appealed the event. Dr. John Allen and a group of AIBS board members published a clarification notice in Science, citing their principal concern. It is not appropriate nor proper for an organization representing a large segment of the biological community to actively participate in a celebration honoring 25 years of biological and chemical warfare research. It is not proper for AIBS to lend its name and prestige to this celebration, indirectly conveying the impression that AIBS actively favors this aspect of Defense Department activity. The essential issue is a moral one. World consensus among physicians and scientists was much the same. 1 year after the $10 million DoD appropriation for the development of AIDS-like viruses, the National Cancer Institute received the bulk of Fort Detrick's facilities. Robert Gallo and his co-workers published 8 scientific articles. The United States National Security Council is the highest decision-making body on foreign policy in the United States. On December 10, 1974, it promulgated a top-secret document entitled National Security Study Memorandum 200, also called the Kissinger Report. Its subject was implications of worldwide population growth for the U.S. security and overseas interests. This document, published shortly after the first major international population conference in Bucharest, was the result of collaboration among the Central Intelligence Agency, the United States Agency for International Development, and the Departments of State, Defense, and Agriculture. The National Security Study Memorandum 200 was made public when it was declassified and was transformed to the U.S. National Archives in 1990. Although the United States government has issued hundreds of policy papers dealing with various aspects of American national security since 1974, NSSM 200 continues to be the foundational document on population control issued by the United States government. It therefore continues to represent social United States policy on population control and is posted on the USAID website. The National Security Study Memorandum 200 explicitly lays out the detailed strategy by which the United States government aggressively promotes population control in developing nations in order to regulate or have better access to the natural resources of these countries. The following outline shows the elements of this plan with actual supporting quotes from the National Security Study Memorandum 200. The United States needs widespread access to the mineral resources of less developed nations. 2. The smooth flow of resources to the United States could be jeopardized by LDC government action, labor conflicts, sabotage, or civil disturbances, which are much more likely, if possible, if pressure is a factor. These types of frustrations are much more less likely under conditions of slow or sub-zero population growth. 3. Young people are much more likely to challenge imperialism and the world's power structures, so their numbers should be kept down as much as possible. These young people can more readily be persuaded to attack the legal institutions of the government or real property of the establishment, imperialists, multinational corporations, or other often foreign influences blamed for their troubles. However, the primary purposes of U.S.-funded population control efforts is to maintain access to the mineral resources of less developed countries, termed as LDCs. The National Security Memorandum 200 says that the U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad, especially from less developed countries. In order to protect U.S. commercial interests, the national security National Security Study Memorandum cited a number of factors that could interrupt the smooth flow of materials from LDCs or less developed countries to the United States, including a large population of anti-imperialist youth, whose numbers must be limited by population control. Within the overall array of U.S. foreign assistance programs, preferential treatment and allocation of funds and manpower should be given to cost-effective programs to reduce population growth, including both family planning activities and supportive activities and their sectors. Kissinger further alluded that throughout the implementation process, the United States must hide its tracks and disguise its programs as altruistic. While some have argued for use of explicit leverage to force better population programs on LDC governments, there are several practical constraints on our efforts to achieve program improvements. Attempts to use leverage for far less sensitive issues have generally caused political frictions and often backfired. Successful family planning requires strong local dedication and commitment that cannot, over the long run, be enforced from the outside. There is also the danger that some LDC leaders will see developed country pressures for family planning as a form of economic or racial imperialism. This could create a serious backlash. While arguing for reducing global population growth by 500 million people by the year 2000, Kissinger noted elsewhere in his report that the population problem was already causing 10 million deaths yearly. In short, he advocated doubling the death rate to at least 20 million in the name of addressing the problem of deaths due to lack of sufficient food, as quoted on page 10 of the 123-page declassified document. Point 28. World policy and programs in the population field should incorporate two major objectives: actions to accommodate continued population growth, up to 6 billion by the mid-21st century, without massive starvation or total frustration of development hopes. And B, actions to keep the ultimate level as close as possible to 8 billions, rather than permitting it to reach 10 billions, 13 billions, or more. 29. While specific goals in this area are difficult to state, our aim should be for the world to achieve a replacement level of fertility, a two-child family on the average, by about the year 2000. This will require the present 2% growth rate to decline to 1.7% within a decade and to 1.1% by 2000, compared to the UN medium projection. This goal would result in 500 million fewer people in 2000 and about 3 billion fewer in 2050. Attainment of this goal will require greatly intensified population programs. A basis for developing national population growth control targets to achieve this world target is contained in the World Population Plan of Action. Conclusion. From the very beginning, the concept of a population explosion was an ideologically motivated false alarm specifically designed to allow rich nations to pillage the resources of the poorer nations. The resulting push for population control in lower developed countries has borne absolutely no positive fruit in its decades of implementation. In fact, population control ideologies and programs make it even more difficult to respond to the impending grave crisis looming in the form of a disastrous worldwide population implosion. It is time to begin urging families to have more children, not less, if we are to avoid a worldwide demographic catastrophe. There is growing awareness that the world's population explosion is over, or indeed that it never actually materialized. When the population scare began in the late 1960s, the world's population was increasing at a rate of more than 2% per year. It is now increasing at less than 1% per year, and this rate is expected to continue to drop due to continuing population control activities. The National Security Study Memorandum 200 predicted that the population of the world would stabilize at about 10 to 13 billion, with some demographers predicting that the world population would balloon to as high as 22 billion people. Now it is estimated that by 2050, population will level out at around 9.7 billion. So basically, these people created AIDS as a way to depopulate third world countries that they deemed could essentially become independent, and they created these disastrous diseases just to get minerals from these countries. The theory that AIDS comes from monkeys actually comes from Robert Gallo, who in 1983, excuse me, started that theory that AIDS virus arose from an African monkey virus that naturally jumped species and then was carried by Portuguese seamen to Japan. However, in 1971, Gallo and his team published a seemingly conflicting statement, quoting only one virus of 27 then known RNA retroviruses, which contain reveries transcriptase, they wrote, does not seem to be oncogenic, cancer-causing, the simian foamy-virus. Well, the simian foamy-virus is the virus that Gallo initially stated was the virus that jumped species to man. But then in an earlier quote, he said that it doesn't cause cancer. So let's get some more information on Gallo and what he has been up to. At the time, simian monkey foamy-viruses were known to be common, humanly benign, and vaccine contaminants. Had the simian virus simply jumped species then? It's doubtful, gaining that cancer-causing capabilities seen in AIDS. Additional mutations would have been needed to make it so carcinogenic. Well, there's proof that Gallo modified monkey viruses with cat leukemia. Gallo and company, including frequent co-author Robert Ting from Lytton Bionetics, reported modifying simian monkey virus by infusing them with cat leukemia RNA to make them cause cancers, as seen in people with AIDS. Gallo and his co-worker Seituku Fujioka concluded from studies conducted in late 1969 or early 1970 that they would need to further evaluate the functional significance of tRNA changes in tumor cells. To do this, they designed an experiment in which specific tumor cell tRNAs were added directly to normal cells. They explained that one way of doing this was to use viruses to deliver the foreign cancer-producing tRNA to the normal cells. The viruses that they used for this purpose were the simian monkey virus SV40 and the mouse parotid tumor polyomavirus. These experiments could have easily established the technology for the development of HIV, allegedly of simian virus descent, which similarly delivers reverse transcriptase and a foreign cat leukemia sarcoma-like RNA to normal human white blood cells. Then Gallo presents his methods and materials used to produce AIDS like viruses before NATO military scientists at the NATO International Symposium on Uptake of Informative Molecules by Living Cells. Gallo and his co-workers presented research describing the experimental entry of bacterial RNA into human WBCs before a special symposium sponsored by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences discussed several possible mechanisms prompting the entry of foreign nucleic acids into lymphocytes. Gallo is linked to the entry and control of foreign nucleic acids held on April 4th and 5th, 1969 at Fort Detrick, and noted Gallo's link to this work. Gallo's presentation is documented evidence that Robert Gallo, acting as senior investigator, presented the methods and materials used to produce AIDS-like viruses before NATO military scientists at the NATO International Symposium on Uptake of Informative Molecules by Living Cells in Mole, Belgium in 1970. Gallo and his co-workers even published studies identifying the mechanisms responsible for reduced amino acid and protein synthesis by T lymphocytes required required for immune system failure, as evidenced in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, 1967. The specific enzymes required to produce such effects, along with a base pair switch mutation, and the genes of WBCs to produce the small DNA changes needed to create extreme immune system failure. The methods by which human white blood cells, DNA degradation, and immune system may be prompted by the pooling of nucleic acids, purine bases, or the addition of specific chemical reagents. A subsequent study published in 1970 by Gallo and his colleagues identified RNA-dependent DNA polymerase. Gallo's team noted that this enzyme was responsible for gene amplification and biochemical cytodifferentiation, the development of unique WBC characteristics including cancer cell production, and leukemogenesis, the production of leukemia. Another of their studies identified L-asparginase synthetase, an important enzyme that, if blocked, will cause treatment-resistant leukemias and other cancers, as published in Nature, 1970. By 1972, Gallo and his co-workers studied portions of simian monkey and mouse salivary gland tumor viruses to determine differences in RNA activity between infected versus uninfected cancer cells. They wrote, by studying viral or cellular mutants or cell segregants, which have conditional variations and virus-specific cellular alterations, it should be possible to more precisely determine the biological significance of the RNA variation here. The group was trying to determine the importance of various viral genes on the development of human cancers and immune system collapse. They reported their desire to use this information to find a cure for cancer, but at this time their activity was more focused on creating various cancers and carcinogenic viruses that could infect humans. From this work published, Gallo showed that he was actually cloning simian monkey viruses as early as 1970. So allegations that he had cloned Montanier's virus were buffeted by the fact that he had over a decade of practice in the procedure. Another example of Gallo's work in creating new viruses to cause cancer in humans was published for the benefit of the NAS. Here, Gallo and company examined the activity of the special AIDS-linked DNA polymerase enzyme in normal versus acute immature leukemic lymph cells, that is, lymphoblasts. To do so, they evaluated the single-stranded 770S RNA retrovirus found in chickens, which caused prominent features of AIDS, including WBC dysfunction, sarcomas, progressive wasting, and death. Gallo and his team injected this chicken virus RNA into human WBCs to determine if the cells were prompted to produce proteins and new viruses called for by the viral RNA. Another Gallo team evaluated the human cancer-causing effects of the single-stranded 70s RNA reverse transcriptase enzyme, a genetic catalyst essentially identical to the one found in HIV. They used cat leukemia viruses and Mason Pfizer monkey viruses to deliver these carcinogens to adult normal human lymphocytes. Other Gallo publications detailed the steps involved in creating immune system-destroying cancer-causing viruses by adapting monkey, rat, and bird leukemia and tumor viruses for experimental use in a human cell line. In conclusion, Robert Gallo had been making immune-compromising viruses by combining animal viruses with human white blood cells, and thus creating immuno-destroying viruses that could not be cured by conventional medication. Similar to the outbreak of HIV/AIDS following the hepatitis B vaccination trials was the smallpox vaccine eradication programs sponsored by the World Health Organization in Africa. On May 11, 1987, the London Times, one of the world's most respected newspapers, published a front-page story entitled "Smallpox Vaccine Triggered AIDS Virus." The story suggests that AIDS in Africa is a direct outgrowth of the World Health Organization's smallpox eradication program. The Times story is one of the most important stories ever printed on the AIDS epidemic. Yet the story was killed and never appeared in any major U.S. newspaper or magazine. Millions of Africans are reportedly infected with HIV. This large number could never have been infected by the simple act of a monkey virus jumping over to infect one African in the late 1970s. If that were the case, why don't we now have millions of AIDS cases in the U.S.? The obvious explanation for the result of millions of Africans infected with AIDS is just like that of the hepatitis B vaccines that were given to select gay populaces living in major metropolitan cities in the U.S. The vaccinations are biological weapons intended for mass depopulation. Henry Kissinger is quoted himself as stating in 1973, "Depopulation should be the highest priority of foreign policy towards the Third World, because the U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad, especially from less developed countries." A decade before the first cases of AIDS, Dr. Donald M. MacArthur, a spokesman for the U.S. Department of Defense, told a congressional hearing that a supergerm could be developed as part of our experimental biowarfare program. This genetically engineered germ would be very different from any previous microbe known to mankind. The agent would be a highly effective killing agent because the immune system would be powerless against this super microbe. A transcript of the meeting on synthetic biological agents records the following comments of Dr. MacArthur. Number 1. All biological agents up to the present time are representatives of naturally occurring disease and thus are known by scientists throughout the world. They are easily available to qualified scientists for research, either for offensive or defensive purposes. Within the next 5 to 10 years, it would probably be possible to make a new infective microorganism which could differ in certain important aspects from any known disease causing organisms. Most important of these is that it might be refractory to the immunological and therapeutic processes upon which we depend to maintain our relative freedom from infectious disease. A research program to explore the feasibility of this could be complete in approximately 5 years at a total cost of $10 million. It would be very difficult to establish such a program. Molecular biology is a relatively new science. There are not many competent scientists in the field. Almost all are in university laboratories, and they are generally adequately supported from sources other than the Department of Defense. However, it was considered possible to initiate an adequate program through the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council. The matter was discussed with the NASNRC, and tentative plans were made to initiate the program. However, decreasing funds in chemical biological research, growing criticism of the CB program, and our reluctance to involve the NASNRC in such a controversial endeavor have led us to postpone it for the past 2 years. It is a highly controversial issue, and there are many who believe such research should not be undertaken. Let it lead to yet another method of massive killing of large populations. Should an enemy develop it, there is little doubt that it is an important area of potential military technological inferiority in which there is no adequate research program. This testimony proves further that HIV was created in biowarfare laboratories organized by specific branches of the U.S. military and funded through U.S. Army government contracted pharmaceutical companies. During the 1970s, the U.S. Army's biowarfare program intensified, particularly in the area of DNA and gene splicing research. Renouncing germ warfare except for medical defensive research, President Richard Nixon in 1971 ordered that a major part of the Army's biowarfare research be transferred over to the National Cancer Institute, exactly where HIV would be discovered a decade later by Dr. Robert Gallo. Dr. Leonard Horowitz and Dr. Alan Cantrell have decisively proven that AIDS is a man-made disease and that it was released into targeted populations through vaccination trials. The virus that is known as AIDS is a multitude of animal cancers that is used to destroy a person's immune system, and that AIDS is a bioweapon created by the U.S. Army to realize the objectives of the Council on Foreign Relations and depopulating the world. The Council on Foreign Relations is a puppet think tank group subservient to the Rockefellers, who are subservient to the Vatican. In 1969, Colonel MacArthur testified to Congress requesting $10 million for the Pentagon to develop within 10 years a synthetic virus that would be resistant to the human immune system. In 1972, a World Health Organization memorandum spelled out the coming pandemic. The report indicated that infection with certain retroviruses could result in selective damage to the immune system, particularly white blood cells known as T cells, which is exactly what AIDS destroys. The immune system damaged could also lead to cancer, as AIDS sufferers have a high risk of developing cancers. AIDS has been a bioweapon of devastating effect. It has killed over 35 million people. 2 million people are infected every year, and over 1 million people die from it each year. The Rockefeller Foundation's support for eugenics, the movement at killing or sterilizing people whose heredity made them a public burden, became the prime promoter of depopulation activities by the United Nations. Moreover, evidence showed the Foundation and its corporate, medical, and political associates organized the racial mass murder program of Nazi Germany, and now they have organized the mass murder of 35 million plus people through their man-made biological warfare agent, the retrovirus we call HIV and AIDS. The Rockefellers are publicly known to have been in a supporting role to the Nazis, supplying them with chemicals, weapons, and gasoline through the German chemical company IG Farben. While Hitler rose to power, the Eugenics Federation, backed by the Rockefellers, became a section of the Nazi state. The Swiss psychiatrist Dr. Ernst Rudin headed the Nazi eugenics program, called the Task Force of Heredity Experts, chaired by SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. Rudin's protege, Joseph Mengele, conducted horrible experiments at Auschwitz, all in the name of eugenics. The Rockefellers have once again committed the darkest and most grave atrocities to the world, and this time they attacked their own country by unleashing this man-made retrovirus that we call AIDS, a retrovirus they helped fund and create years in the making. And today, this same retrovirus is being spread throughout the world in all kinds of various vaccinations. Robert Strecker says that there's one way to cure AIDS, and this leads to a form of medicine that came out in the early 20s but was sabotaged. But this is what Strecker has to say. Just as viruses are little crystals, you might hit them with electromagnetic frequencies and destroy them. Just as you can shake down a crystal and destroy it without disrupting the surrounding house, you can theoretically disrupt viruses without destroying the surrounding cell structure. Well, we already have people who have not only proven that this works, but they've also destroyed HIV and AIDS. So now we'll be entering the era of new medicine or future medicine. Research has shown that artificial light that simulates sunlight supports the body's light-dependent functions. Compared to other artificial light, it lowers bodily stress, resulting in improved health, mood, behavior, and learning. Based on this information, we need to broaden our concepts regarding the purpose of light. Light can no longer be thought of as merely a technological advancement used to illumine our environment, but must be embraced as potentially one of the most powerful disease prevention tools at our disposal. Dr. John Ott is one of the pioneering scientists in this field who illustrated the ability of light to affect health. In 1964, Ott conducted experiments showing that mice living under pink fluorescent light were more likely to develop cancer and reproductive problems. To confirm the accuracy of Ott's findings, researchers at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences undertook extensive research on a special strain of mice bred to develop tumors. Divided into 3 groups, the mice were assigned to live in separate environments, each one lighted by a different kind of fluorescent light. One light was a pink, as in Ott's experiments. The second was cool white, and the third was daylight, simulating full spectrum. The group living under the pink fluorescence were the first to develop tumors after 42 weeks. Just as Ott reported, the cool white and full spectrum groups developed tumors in 47 and 51 weeks, respectively. After 573 days, each group of mice seemed to develop a different level of resistance to cancer. It is evident that the lighted environment affects development, level of health, and longevity. To further illustrate this point, consider the work of Dr. Joanne Smith Sonneborn, a professor of zoology and physiology at the University of Wyoming. Her work is based on research indicating that in order for a cell to become cancerous, it must first sustain damage to its hereditary blueprint. She noticed that the incidence of cancer increases with age, suggesting that the older people are, the greater is the likelihood for them to have accumulated the DNA damage that precedes cancer. Using single-celled organisms called paramecia, she was able to demonstrate that old cells do actually show an accumulation of DNA damage. Having already exposed her paramecia to far ultralight radiation, which caused DNA damage and also shortened the cell's lifespans, she wished to see whether repairing this damage would actually reverse the accelerated aging caused by the exposure. She therefore exposed the damaged cells to near ultraviolet radiation and found that the cells not only repaired themselves but also reversed aging. After repairing these previously damaged cells with UVA radiation, Dr. Smith Sonneborn exposed cells once again to the UVA radiation. What she found was that the second exposure extended the lifespan of the cells by up to 50%, compared with the cells in the control group. Her findings clearly showed that certain types of light are not only capable of assisting cells in repairing their DNA, but also have the ability to stimulate life-extending capabilities with the DNA. What does Dr. Smith Sonneborn's discovery mean to the science of human disease prevention and longevity, especially if it is discovered that human cells have the same capabilities? Obviously, light is important to optimum health and disease prevention. It also can be used to treat in the treatment of life-threatening diseases. Scientists at Baylor University Medical Center have used light to destroy viruses causing AIDS and other infectious diseases. Under the leadership of Dr. Lester Matthews, director of the Baylor Research Foundation, new technology is being developed that could decontaminate blood for transfusions, eliminating the risk of transfusion infections from viruses such as those that cause herpes and AIDS. Using the same photosensitive chemical photoprin and red light used by Thomas Doherty, Lester Matthews and other researchers have been able to kill 100% of viruses causing herpes simplex 1, measles, AIDS, and other illnesses without any evidence of damage to normal blood elements. These researchers believe that photodynamic therapy can be effective against all viruses encased in viral envelopes, including those causing hepatitis, AIDS, and some forms of leukemia. The most encouraging aspect of this technology is that it can selectively destroy viruses and other impurities without harming the blood itself. This is a major advancement in blood decontamination technology. Present blood screening techniques are less than 100% effective, since in rare cases certain viruses are not detectable even though they are present. The excellent track record of blood irradiation therapy in the treatment of other viruses would appear to make it a promising candidate to be an expensive, low toxicity, high compliance, and effective treatment of HIV. A few Russian physicians have used LBI on HIV, and there are several intriguing reports. Anecdotal reports of the same effectiveness of BI are mixed, and only a few have made their way into print. One German source claims the disappearance of HIV from the blood following hematogenic oxidation therapy of a 24-year-old woman. The pattern that emerges is reminiscent of BI's record in certain other diseases. Many of the HIV patients who turn to UBI practitioners have advanced or even terminal disease with hundreds of billions of copies of viruses and devastated immune systems. And so UBI has little effect on their condition, and that is a palliative at best. If it is a relatively early stage, then it is likely that BI can be effective because BI relies on the underlying order of the body to achieve its pharmacological effect. Once that order is undermined by the progression of a disease to an advanced stage, it becomes much less likely that blood irradiation therapy can be effective, though there are reports of it curing diseases many years standing. Thus, it must be anticipated that blood irradiation therapy is potentially very effective in the treatment of early-stage HIV. Blood irridation's track record in the treatment of other infectious diseases suggests that it would be as effective as the protease inhibitors in reducing virus in the blood to below detectable levels. Less clear, however, is whether the virus could develop resistance to blood irradiation therapy. It is to be expected that blood irradiation therapy will be more effective than protease inhibitors in the treatment of many HIV-related conditions. In particular, it should be very effective in the treatment of hepatitis, pneumonia, and various opportunistic infections. It is unlikely, however, that blood irradiation therapy can have a significant effect in Kaposi sarcoma. The relatively low cost of blood irradiation therapy would make it ideal for the treatment of poor HIV patients in developing countries, the great majority of new HIV cases.